The awakening of China and Japan in Asia. The first to tackle is China. China proper. The empire consists of five grand divisions: China proper, Manchuria, Mongolia, Turkestan, and Tibet. In treating of this huge conglomerate, it will be the most convenient to begin with the portion that gives name and character to the whole. Of China proper, it may be affirmed that the sun shines nowhere on an equal area which combines so many of conditions requisite for support of an opulent and prosperous people, lying between 18 and 49 north latitude. Her climate is like exempt from the fierce heat of the torrid zone and the killing cold of the frigid regions. There is not one of her provinces in which wheat, rice, and cotton, these three staples of food and clothing, may not be cultivated with more or less success. But in southern half, wheat gives place to rice, while in the north cotton yields to silk and hemp. In the south, cotton is king and rice is queen of the fields. The origins of Chinese. That parent that the parent stock in which the Chinese nations had its origin was a small migratory people, like the tribes of Israel, and that they entered the land of promise from the northwest is tolerable certain, but to trace their previous wanderings back to Shinar, India or Persia would be waste of time, as the necessary data are lacking even within their appointed domain. The accounts of their early history are too obscure to be accepted as to any extent reliable. The earliest book of history opens with conflicts with aborigines. There can be no question that the slow progress made by the invaders in the following course of those streams on which the most ancient capitals of Chinese were subsequently located was owing to the necessity of fighting their way. Shan, the second sovereign of the whose reign there is record in 2200 BC, is said to have waged war. San Miao, three tribes of Miaozi or aborigines, a term still applied to the independent tribes of the southwest, beaten in the field or the less suffering a temporary check, he took himself to the rites of religion, making offerings and praying to the Shangti, the supreme ruler. After 40 days, it is stated, the natives submitted. In the absence of the explanation, it may be included that during the suspension of hostilities, negotiations were proceeding which resulted not in the destruction of the natives, but in their incorporation with their more civilized neighbors. This first recorded amalgamation of the kind was doubtless an instance of a process of growth that continued for many centuries, resulting in absorption of all the native tribes on the north of the Yangtze, and of the most of those on the south. The expanding state was eventually composed of a vast body of natives who submitted to their civilized conquerors, much as the people of Mexico and Peru consented to be ruled by handfuls of Spaniards. The mythical period. Unlike the Greeks and Hindus, the Chinese are deficient in sort of imagination that breeds a poetical mythology. They are not, however, wanting in that pride of race, which is prone to lay the past as well as to the future. They have accordingly constructed not a mythology but a fictitious history which begins with the creation of the world. How men and animals were made, they not to say. They do not say, but they assert that heaven and earth are united in a state of chaos until a divine man, whom they call Pan Ku, the ancient founder, rent them asunder. Pictures show him wielding a sledgehammer and disengaging the sun and moon from overlaying hills, grotesque conception in a strong contrast with the simple and sublime statement. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Panku was followed by a divine being named Nuwa, in regard to whom it is doubtful whether to speak in the feminine or in the masculine gender, designated queen more frequently than king. It is said of her that, a portion of the sky having fallen down, probably owing to the defective work of her predecessor, she built it with precious stones of many colors. Lianxian Putian to patch the sky with precious stones in a set is a set phrase by which the Chinese indicate that which is fabulous and absurd. Instead of filling the long interval between the creation of the world and the birth of history with gods and fairies, the Chinese covers that the period by three sovereigns whom they called after their favorite triad heaven, earth, and man, giving them the respective titles Tianhuang, Tihuang, and Jinhuang. Each of these resigned 18,000 years, but what they reigned over is not apparent. At all events, they seem to have contributed little to comfort of their people, for at close of that long period, direct inhabitants of empire, the only country then known to exist on earth, had no houses, no clothes, no laws, and no letters. The three dynasties, the Hia, the Hia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties together extend over the 22 centuries preceding the Christian era. The first occupied 440 years, the second 644, and the last, in the midst of turmoil and anarchy, drags out a miserable existence of 874 years. They are grouped together as the Santai or Sanwang, the three houses of kings, because that title was employed by the founder of each. Some of their successors were called Ti, but Huang Ti, the term of for emperor, now in issue, now in use, was never employed until it was assumed by the builder of the Great Wall on the overthrow of the feudal states and the consolidation of the empire in 240 BC. The first dynasty is the House of Hia. It consists of 17 kings and 2 usurpers. Unlike the most founders of royal houses, who come to the throne through a de- deluge of blood, Tayo, has, as has been shown in the last chapter, climbed to that eminence page through deluge of water. Like Noah, the hero of the earlier deluge, seems to have indulged for once at least too freely in the use of wine. A chapter in the book of history entitled "The Warning Against Wine" informs us that one Yeti having made wine presented is to his prince, Tayo. It was delighted with it but discontinued use, saying that in time to come, kings would lose their thrones through fondness and beverage in China wine. In China wine is a common name for all intoxicating drinks that refers to this passage was doubtless an distillation from rice or millet. The second one is the Shang dynasty. It consists of 28 kings. The founder of this dynasty was Shang Tang or Cheng Tang, who to great valor added the virtues of humanity and justice. Pitying the oppressions of the people, he came to them as a deliverer, and the frivolous tyrant was compelled to retire into obscurity. A more remarkable exhibition of public spirit was the offering of himself as a victim to propitiate the wrath of heaven. In a prolonged famine, his prayers having failed to bring rain, the soothsayers that said that a human victim was required. "It shall be myself," he replied. The stripping of his regal robes, he laid himself on the altar. A copious shower has response to this act of devotion. The successor of Xiangtang was his grandson, Taikia, who was under the tutelage of the wise minister named Iyin. Observing the indolence and pleasure-loving disposition of the young man, the minister sent him to retirement for 3 years, that he might acquire habits and sobriety and diligence. The circumstances that makes this incident worth recording in the minister, instead of retaining the power in his own family, restored the throne to his rightful occupant. The Sage of China. Oh wait, technical difficulty. The Sage of China. China has had more and wiser sages than any other ancient country. Some of them may be referred to the sequel, but this chapter I shall devote chiefly to the two who, by universal consent, have no equals in the history of empire, Confucius and Mencius. These great men owe much of their fame to learned Jesuits who first brought them on the stage. Clad in the Roman toga, and he made them citizens of the world by giving them euphonious names by which they are popularly known: stripped of their disguise, they appear respectively in as Kung Fu Che and Meng Che, exchanging the one rotunda of Rome for a civili- civili- civilization of China. They never could have been naturalized as they are now. Confucius, born in the year 549 BC, Confucius was contemporaneous with Isaiah and Socrates. Of a respectable but not opulent family, he had to struggle for his education, a fact which, in the after years, he was so far from concealing that he ascribed to it much of his success in life. To one who asked him, "How comes it that you are able to do so many things?" he replied, "I was born poor and had to learn." His schoolmasters are known, and it might be asked of him as it was of a greater than Confucius. How knoweth this man letters, having never learned of his self-education, which continued through life, and he gives the following concise amount. At 15, I entered a life of study. At 30, I took stand as a scholar. At 40, my opinions were fixed. At 50, I knew how to judge and select. At 60, I never relapsed into known fault. At 70, I could follow my inclinations without going wrong. Note how each stage marks an advantage toward moral excellence. Mark also that this passage gives an outline of self-discipline. It says nothing of his book or his work as statements and a reformer. Mencius. 100 years later, Mencius was born and received his doctrine through the grandson of the sage, more eloquent than his great master, more bold in rebuking the vice of the princess. He was less original. One specimen of his teaching must suffice. One of the prince asking him, "How do you know that I have it into me to become a good ruler?" He replied, "I am told that seeing the extreme terror of an ox that was being led to the altar, you release and command a sheep to be offered in its stead. The ox was before your eyes, and you pitied it. The sheep was not before your eyes, and you had no pity on it. Now with such a heart, if you would only think of your people so as to bring them before your eyes, you might become the best of rulers." Mencius lost his father in his infancy, but his mother showed rare good sense in bringing them up for her only child. Living near a butcher, she noticed that the boy mimicked the cries of the pigs. She then removed the gate of a cemetery, but noticing that child changed his tune and mocked the wailing of mourners, she struck her tent and took up her abode near a high school. There she observed with joy that he learned the manners and acquired the taste of a student, perceiving, however, that he was in danger of becoming lazy and dilatory. She cut the wrap of her web and said, "My son, this is what you are doing with the web of life." Lao Tse. He, he bore to the family of Li or plum tree, either from the fact that his cottage was in a garden, or possibly because, like an academics, he placed his school in a grove of plum trees, the name which he now known signifies "old master," probably because he was older than Confucius. The latter is said to have paid him to visit, inquire about rites and ceremonies, but Lao Tse, with his love of solitude and abstract speculation, seems not to have exerted much influence on the mind of the rising philosopher. In allusion to him, Confucius said, "Away from men, there is no philosophy, no Tao." Less honored by the official class, Lao Tzu's influence with the masses of China has been scarcely less than that of his younger rival. Like the other two sages, he too was today a representative who enjoys an official status as high priest to the Tao sect. Chang Tianxi dwells in a stately palace on the summit of the Tiger, in the Dragon Mountain, in Jiangxi, as the head of one the three religions, but alas, the sublime teaching found of Taoism degenerated into contemptible mixture of judgely and witchcraft. The warring states, ambitions and jealousies led to petty wars. The king of the too feeble to repress them. These petty wars grew into vast combinations like the leagues of modern Europe. Five of the states acquired at different times such a preponderance that their rulers are styled "wupa", the five indicators of one of one of these Duke Huan of the western Shantou. Western Shantung is famous for having 9 times convoked the States General. The dictator always presides at such meetings, and he was recognized as the real sovereign, as were the mayors of the France and in the Merovingian epoch, or the shoguns in Japan during the long period in which Mikado was called the spiritual emperor. The mythical period. In China, the shifting of power from hand to hand. Those 4 centuries in an age of diplomacy whenever some great baron was suspected of aspiring to the leadership, combinations were formed to curb his ambition. Embassies sped from court to court, and armies were marshaled in the field, and envoys became noted for courage and cunning. The generals acquired fame by their skills in handling large bodies of soldiers. Diplomacy became an art and war a science. An international code control of the intercourse of state began to take shape. But the diplomat was not embarrassed by multiplicity of roles. In negotiation, individual characters counted for more than it does at the present day. Nor must it suppose that in the absence of modern artillery there was no room for generalship. On the contrary, as battles were not decided by the weight of metal, there was more demand for strategies. The three kingdoms, the Nanpei Chao, and the Nanpe, Zhou, and the Zhou dynasty. After 4 centuries of the undisputed sway, the sceptre is seen already to fall from the nerveless hands and feeble monarchs. Eunuchs usurp authority, and the hydra of a rebellion raises its many heads. Minor aspirants are easily extinguished, but three of them survive a conflict of 20 years and lay the foundation of short-lived dynasties. The noble structure erected by the Qins, consolidated by the Hans, began to crumble and beginning of its fifth century of existence. In 221 AD, its fragments were removed to three cities, each of which claimed to be the seat of empire. The state of Wei was founded by Cao Cao, with its capital of Luoyang. The seats of Hans he had the further advantage as mayor of the palace of the holding in his power. The feeble Emperor Huangdi, the last of the House of Han, the state of Wu embracing the province of Jiangsu, Jiangxi, and Zhenjiang, was established by Xu Qian, a man of distinguished ability, who secured his full share of patrimony. The third state was founded by Liu Pi and Liu Pi, a scion of the imperial house, whose capital was at Qingtou Fu, and Shekshun, the historian, is confronted by the problem of settling the apostolic succession of the three popes, and he has decided in favor of the last, whom designates the lateran, mainly on the ground of blood relationship. The Tang Dynasty. I have seen a river plunge into chasms and disappear. After a subterranean course of many miles, it rose to the surface fuller stronger than before. No man saw from whence it drew its increment of force, but the fact was undeniable. This is just what took place in China as epoch. It is not comforting to know that during the centuries of turmoil, the Chinese were not wholly engrossed with war and rapine. The Tang Dynasty is conspicuously that Augustan age. Literature reappears in a more perfect form than under the preceding reigns. The prose writers of that period are to the present day studied as model of composition, which cannot be affirmed of the writers of an early epoch. Poetry, too, shone for which dazzling splendor. A galaxy of poets made their appearance, among whom two particular stars were Tu Fu and Li Bai, the Dryden and Pope of Chinese literature. One of the House of Tang, a score of factions contended for the succession during the 53 years preceding the establishment of the Songs. No less than five of them rose to contemporary prominence. sufficient to admit of being dubbed a dynasty. Collectively, they are spoken of as the Five Dynasties. Their names are without exception a repetition of those of former dynasties: Liang, Tang, and Qin, Han, Chu, with the prefix later, suggesting that each claimed to be lineal successor of the previous imperial family. Their struggles for power not more instructive than a conflict of gladiators. As so devoid of interest that he have century covered by them may be passed over as a blank, it may followed by the wars of the three kingdoms, and that of Qin by the struggle of north and south under the four states. So the house of Tang was now succeeded by five short-lived dynasties, with a mean duration of scarcely more than 10 years. The numerical progression is curious, but it is more important to notice historical law, which native Chinese writers deduce from those scenes of Confucius. They state it in this form: after long union, the empire is sure to be divided. After long disruption, it is sure to be reunited. The Yun or Mongol dynasty. Parts of China had been frequently overrun by foreign conquerors, but the Mongols were the first to extend their sway over the whole country. The subjugation of China was work of Kublai grandson and Genghis, who came to the throne in 1260, inheriting an empire more extensive than Alexander or Caesar had dreamed of. In 1264, the new Khan fixed his court, repealing and proceeded to reduce the provinces of subjection. Exhausted and disunite as they were, the task was not difficult, though it took 15 years to complete. Ambition alone would have been sufficient motive for the conquest, but his hostility was provoked by perfidy, especially by the murder of envoys sent to announce his accession. Without good faith, says Confucius, no nation can exist. By the absorption of China, the dominions of Kublai were made richer, if not greater in extent than those of his grandfather, while the splendor of his court quite eclipsed that of Genghis Khan. The Ming Dynasty. Humble as was the origin of the founder of the House of Han, spoken as of Oi, a peasant close of homespun, that one of the father of the Mings was still more obscure, and vice or servant, sacrificus, or Buddhist monastery. Chuyan Zhang felt called to deliver his people from oppression, at first regarded as a robber chief. One of many, his rivals submitted to his leadership, and the people accepted his protection, securing possession of Nanking, a city of illustrious, illustrious memories and strong natural defenses. He boldly proclaimed his purpose. After 20 years of blood and tragedy, he succeeded in placing the Great Wall between him and the retreating Mongols. Proud of his victory, he assumed for the little of his reign, Hongwu, great warrior, and Chusming Luminous for that of his dynasty, leaving his son, the Prince of Yan, at Peking to hold the Tartars in checking Hongwu spent the remaining years of his reign at original capital and then left the, the sceptre to his grandson, the Prince of Yan, uncle of the youthful emperor, feeling the slight implied in his father's choice, raised an army and captured Nanking, the charred corpse being shown to him as that the emperor he caused it to be interred with becoming rites, and at once assumed that imperial dignity, choosing for his reign little Yonglo. Perpetual joy, he also removed the seat of government to Peking, where it has remained for 5 centuries. The Thesaurus of Yongle, a digest of Chinese literature, so extensive as to form a library in itself, remains a monument to his patronage of letters. The Ta Qing dynasty. The Manchus had been preparing for some generations for a descent on China. They had never forgotten that half empire had once been in the possession of their forefathers, the Qin Tartars, and after one or two abortive attempts to recover their heritage, they settled themselves at Mukden and watched their opportunity it came with the fall of the Ming. Mu Sanque, a Chinese general whose duty it was to keep them in bounds, threw open the gate of the Great Wall and invoked their assistance to extend. The successful rebel, his family had been slaughtered in the fall of the capital. He thirsted for revenge, and without doubt indulged the hope of founding a dynasty. The Manchus agreed to his terms, and combining their force with his, advanced Peking, feeling himself unable to hold the city. The rebel chief burned this place and retreated after enjoying the imperial dignity in 10 days. The Russo-Japanese War. To the Chinese, the retrospect of these 5 wars left little room for those pompous pretensions which appeared to, to be their vital breath. Beaten by Western powers and the new power of the East, their capital taken second time after 40 years, opportunity to fortify, and their fugitive court recalled the second time for reign sovereigns or during good behavior. Behavior what had they left both except the antiquity of their country and the number of their people. Days and paralysis of them gave the way to a sullen resignation that differed little from despair. There were indeed a few who, before things came to the worst, saw that China's misfortunes were due to folly, not fate. Ignorant conservatism had made her weak; vigorous reform might make her strong. But another war was required to turn the feeling of the few into conviction of the many. This change was accomplished by the war waged with their borders not but to which they were not a party, a war which was not an act in international drama, but a spectacle for which they furnish the stage. That spectacle calls for notice in the present work of account of its influence on the destinies of China. So the next is the awakening of China.